Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Hi there, this is Rhombus Ticks again. Welcome back. Today we're going to get straight right into reading, so sit right back and listen to Grenademan vs. the Zombies by T.C. Ricks, Chapter 11. Jarvi and Laura trudged up Mount Hood. Jarvi had used a lot of anima to float about halfway up the mountain. Laura got the wonderful idea of hiking instead of floating. Taking athletic day trips when one wanted to unleash the elemental power of the ages during the zombie apocalypse was a perfectly reasonable idea. Why not? Laura kissed him on the cheek when he agreed. Despite the fact that he enjoyed it, he didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing. After all, he was perfectly capable of using anima to enhance his arms and legs in a slow and subtle motion to make it so that even if he was using muscle power to walk instead of his mind, and like the rest of his magic, it was only as tiring as dealing with most of humanity, which was to say, noticeable, but nothing he couldn't handle. Laura looked out and smiled when they reached the summit. Wow, you can see probably California from here. What a view. What about the view attracts your attention, Laura? The soaring trees and vistas? Or the smoke from half a dozen burning cities? Is it the carrion birds circling what the zombies didn't eat? Or might that be the stench of rotten decay that isn't quite so bad up here? Laura looked at him and batted her eyes. Oh, Jarvi, you're so romantic. Jarvi looked into the sleeping volcano. There was power here. Power he'd never felt before when he'd been a normal person. But then again, he'd never be normal again. You couldn't undo Chaos's gift like that. At this point, he ignored any pretense of pretending to exercise and floated down into the crater. He could feel the power of the magma far beneath the ashen rock under his feet. Reaching into his pocket, Jarvi took out a third seed and placed it in the ground, along with a human skull that they had collected earlier. This spell would be slightly different than that of the other two seeds. He floated back out and set himself on the rim. Taking out the Predundonomicon, he began to read. He read for a solid hour, but nothing seemed to happen. Laura looked bored, but brought him water when he motioned for it. Finally, the mountain began to shake. Laura instinctively moved closer to Jarvi. She looked scared. Jarvi smiled. Good. She'd done a very good job of masking her fear up to this point, and sometimes he respected her for it. But an outward sign of respect was for the true power he now had was also very gratifying. He continued to read. He dare not interrupt the ritual at this point. The words carried his voice out into the wind, taking on a life of their own and echoing back and forth around him. He called to the volcano, whispered to this bit of Mother Earth. He taunted her, beckoned her, dared her to awaken from her slumber. He told her that she was weak and that she could not possibly respond to him. Slow to action, slower to thought. Who was it that really had the power here? If she could whisper and she couldn't ignore him, she proved that he was right and she was wrong. In the end, the process wasn't really that much different from the Snarks. It was just on a larger scale. She was a goddess, and the volcano was a powerful giant, a subset of her mind. They were gods and beings of amazing power, long ignored by almost all of the mortal world. They had been largely too bored to care long ago when mortals worshipped them on a regular basis. But they had egos just like any other living being, and Jarvi was challenging them. Most gods really only cared when they felt someone was getting something up on them. And while most of them might feign indifference, Jarvi's words twisted like knives. They missed the attention of mortals, but they hated the mockery that came from Jarvi's mouth. And when they couldn't take no more, they responded in fire and smoke and ash and power. The seed brought death on the wind. The doors of the afterlife were unlocked, and the spirits of death, but not the dead, soared down to take form in the corpses of the buried ones. The earth was insulted, and now she would return the insulting kind by demonstrating her wrath upon humanity. Cast forth were the buried, recycled offerings of humanity. Broken from the cycle of life, the truest of all true zombies came forth into the world of the living. The force that hammered against the anima shield he threw around himself and Laura was unimaginable. If conventional physics had ruled the day, the two of them would have been instantly vaporized by the heat and sheer kinetic force of the explosion. An angry volcano threw his might at them again and again, hurling fireballs that could have leveled a skyscraper. Each assault bounced harmlessly off Jarvi's shield, though, for there were some forces even more powerful than Gaia or her wards. Laura looked up at Jarvi in awe. She was not frightened anymore. Instead, there was a genuine gratitude and respect on her face. This was what Jarvi had been hoping for when he brought her along. She could be a lot more trustworthy now that she knew the scope of his power. Higher and higher into the air they rose, until they were hovering directly over the churning, boiling mass of lava that eyed them angrily. Ash darkened the sky above them and blotted out the sun. The only visible light was from the faint glow of the anima shield in the lava. Jarvi reached out into his bag for the fourth seed. "I'm not done with you yet, old man," he said to the volcano, and dropped the seed through the shield and into the fire below. The mountain roared a second time as it gave birth to an abomination. The ash caught upon the trade winds and flew out into the world. It was a statement to say the entire world was engulfed in darkness. It was actually only 90%. The old man lived high in the mountains. He didn't like to mingle with people. He'd heard the radio reports of zombies bothering people. He'd even shot one or two that tried to make their way up the steep mountain road where he lived. A few well-placed shots with a .56 caliber sniper rifle had ended that nonsense. Sunrise was so pretty. He loved mornings in the mountains. He knew there was something strange about the darkness, but he ignored that for now. There would be time for that once he was done saying good morning to Gloria. "Gloria? Can you hear me, Gloria? I just wanted to let you know that it's been a good day so far. I've had to shoot a few poor souls who got infected by the zombie virus, but otherwise things are going well. You'd love the sunset, dear. Oh, it's probably the end of the world right now, but you know me, I'm a stubborn cuss. They lived up here for 50 years before cancer had taken her. Then he buried her here 2 years ago, and every morning since then he'd come out here and said good morning to her. He'd done that while she was alive. He didn't see any reason to stop now. He'd heard the clawing sound first. He had more than enough time to get the shotgun. He wasn't as fast as he used to be, but he knew the zombies were supposed to come from the grave. But if it was a virus, how had it infected her? Well, that didn't matter. She'd want him to blow off her head now that she was affected. He waited patiently, listening for the scratching as it grew more and more insistent. He felt kind of bad, really, for whatever it was down there trying to get out. He knew that it wasn't his wife. She was in heaven. But it was still her body, and he had some sentimental attachment to it. He was rather surprised when the hand burst forth from the ground right of him and grabbed his ankle. He hadn't been expecting that. No matter. He calmly pointed the gun and blew her hand off at point-blank range. Of course, he forgot the power of the thing and looked down at the stump of his own angle. Probably not too good. He was losing a lot of blood. He almost decided to crawl back into the house, but knew he'd never make it. He didn't want to be one of those things shambling around. He waited for a little bit longer until her head came up out of the ground and screamed voicelessly at him. He blew it off. He was still losing a lot of blood, but he managed to reload and point the gun at his head before blackness overcame him. He pulled the trigger. He wasn't consciously aware of it at first, but as he floated upward and away, he smiled with pride as his headless body rested upon Gloria's grave. He was pleased that they were buried together. Dr. Ozark worked furiously on a cure. She'd never seen a virus like this, but she knew it had to have some kind of mechanism that converted the cells. She'd managed to isolate it, but biologically it made no sense. It was almost as if the virus was intelligent. That might be theoretically possible, but it wasn't a leap she was willing to make just yet. Right now, she was performing an autopsy on one of the victims. Thus far, she hadn't been able to learn much about their general nature. The living ones she had in the box downstairs were incredibly strong and felt no pain. Indeed, they had no sense of their own mortality. They also absolutely refused to eat anything except human flesh. She hadn't had the heart to figure out how long they could go without food. What if she found a cure? But it was just too horrible to think about. So when the creature on the table came back to life, she was insufficiently prepared. It reached for her throat, but her instincts kicked in and caused her to leap back. It barely missed her. Slowly, it sat up and rose off the table and croaked with fury. It didn't say, "Brains." It just shrieked with rage and hunger. There was a very faint glow in its eye cavities. Whatever this thing was, it was even less human than the first type of zombie she'd run into. She didn't want to find out what made it tick. She knew that this body was dead and had been dead for days. She'd been cutting into it, making tissue samples, and examining it for close to over a week. This had clearly left the realm of the natural and gone into the realm of the supernatural. She didn't know a lot, but she knew the best thing she could think of right now was to head to a church. She ran upstairs from her laboratory and heard the zombies slowly shambling after her. At least it wasn't as fast as the bio-zombies, but when she thought about the number of people who had died in the last century, she realized that the problem had just gotten a whole lot worse. How much of the body had to be intact before it could animate, she wondered. If it was just a skeleton, that was going to be a real problem. She cautiously opened the airlock on the outside door and looked out on the empty streets. There was no way to know for sure how many people had survived over the last few days. She tried to keep them alive, but most of them hadn't been willing to believe her. She heard a footfall behind her and turned around. There was a man there who looked pretty living. Still, Ozark had learned discretion was the better part of valor. She finally got the wits to remember her gun and pointed at him while she asked, Who are you?" He raised his hands above his head and said, "My name is Eris Krisk. Interesting name." "I rather thought so. Can you put that down?" He looked nervous, but he also looked like he'd been through hell. "I can, of course, but first tell me what you're doing here." "Just trying to survive." "I do have something you want to hear about, though." "What's that?" she asked, cautiously lowering her gun. "What I tell you 3 times is true."
Shut up! This has been Rhombus Ticks reading to you from the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. All of these products are available on Amazon.com and other marketplaces. Copyright 2015 Red Anvil Amalgamated. Sound editing by Grayson Bergmann. Initial bumper by Electro Rock Cardiogram. To fight the forces of evil!